and for taking the time. I know some folks have said they've been to a couple sessions already today, so hopefully we'll be able to keep you engaged. I know looking at a screen can be tough, but we're glad to have you here. I'm thrilled to have some wonderful panelists with us. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So as you saw when you signed up, this session is called Not in My Backyard, How Detroit Has Fought Back. My name is Hannah. I'll be the moderator of the panel, and we'll be doing a bit of an intro. And I'm here in my capacity as community organizer for climate justice at Hazon Detroit. So again, so thrilled to have you all here and really excited to have some wonderful panelists with us who will be able to share their expertise and experience in the things that we're talking about today. And also, and really importantly, how they've organized and activated around some of the issues that we'll be diving in. So on our panel, we have Julia Cuneo, who is the strategic coordinator at Detroit Area Youth Uniting Michigan. You see it represented on their shirt there. And Detroit Area Youth United Michigan, shortened as DAYUM. We also have Brooke Solomon, the founding chairperson of DAYUM's Youth Board of Directors. And we have Renee Wallace, the executive director of FoodPLUS Detroit. So looking forward to hearing their voices and experiences soon. And we'll start diving in at the beginning with an intro and some context to what we'll be talking about. So I have to remember to be on the right screen to scroll around here. At Hazon, we have a practice of acknowledging those who are native to the land that we're on. Most of us here in the United States live on land that was taken from indigenous peoples, and they steward the land with love and reverence and respect. So it's important that we recognize our place in this and our place as it relates to our responsibility to the earth and all who live upon it. I invite you to, with that in mind, to check out the link on the slide here, native-land.ca, and you'll also see it in the chat. And if you go to that link, it'll take you to a website that'll allow you to put in your zip code, city, town, wherever you are, and it'll let you know who is indigenous to that land. So once you do that, I invite you to share in the chat so we can see who's in the room with us, where you are, city, town, and who's indigenous to the land that you're on. So I'll model that out loud as y'all navigate that website and put your locations in the chat. I'm here in Detroit, which is the native land of the Three Fires Confederacy, which is comprised of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. And so yeah, feel free to put your locations and who's indigenous to that land in the chat. I see we've got Cherokee land in North Carolina, got Philadelphia, which is Lenape land, Lenape land again, awesome. All right, we've got Potsdam, New York, known as Iroquois Confederacy land. We've got Mohican land in Massachusetts. And as you can see in the chat, yeah, for those who are joining us, we're going to the website on this slide right here and seeing who's indigenous to the land that we're on. And then in a means of introduction, putting in the chat where we are and who is indigenous to that land. Oh yeah, and if you see Julia's screen, they pointed out that you can see the river in the map behind her. So the Anishinaabe people named the land that we're in, I'm also in Detroit, as the word for where the water goes around. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so yeah, we've got Northern California, which is Ohlone land. Awesome. So glad to see such an array of folks here with us from all over this land that we call Turtle Island and is more recently called the United States. All right, so as we think about the land that we're on and the communities that we are in and a part of, relating to the title of this session, which the first part is Not in My Backyard, Not in my backyard was a term coined in the 70s when nuclear power plants were being built. And there were a lot of folks saying, I don't want this in my community. I don't want these plants and these facilities near me or my family or my community because they're not safe, right? They could be hazardous, they release pollutants. We don't want that, not in my backyard. And what we'll be talking about a lot today is when those things are possible, we don't want them in anyone's backyard, right? Nobody wants their neighbors and themselves to have to experience this pollution and these environmental hazards. And so if we think at the very basic level, right, at the core, what must exist for a community to be healthy and sustainable? So when no one has to have these polluters in their backyard. So I invite you to share in the chat just whatever comes to mind, where at the most basic level, what does a healthy and sustainable community need? And you can see the question in the chat as well. So feel free to put your answers, whatever comes to mind. I have no doubt that as humans and people who live in community that we can think of some things that would be necessary for a healthy and sustainable community. All right, we've got, clean, affordable water, absolutely. Clean air, water, parks or other nature areas, for sure. Yep, clean air. Everyone giving what they need and taking what they need, absolutely. A community of reciprocity. Shelter, safe food, democracy, food, water, arable land, land to grow, absolutely. All of these things, right? Living in community with other people and with other creatures, and having the resources to do that safely, which amongst other things include clean air, clean water, and a healthy earth, right? The land beneath our feet being healthy and safe. So with this in mind, as these core pieces for what must exist for a healthy and sustainable community, I want to kind of hold that idea as we look at what we'll be diving into moving forward. And we're going to start that thought process with the statistic right here that I'll share, which is that African Americans are exposed to 38% more polluted air than Caucasian Americans. And they're 75% more likely to live in fence-line communities than the average American. So a fence-line community is really a community that lives in close proximity to facilities or industries that produce hazards or toxins or pollutants. It could be noise pollution, air pollution, toxins released into the water, or contamination into the land, things like that. So considering this statistic, we'll be seeing these trends pretty literally illustrated in maps as we move forward, as we'll see instances of where we can see these trends. And again, as the title of this session suggests, we'll be using Detroit as a case study. We'll be talking about how this exists in Detroit. And we'll be highlighting, as you'll see in the coming slides, that this is certainly not unique to Detroit. These trends and issues and environmental injustices exist in many different places. So one place we can see that is Baltimore. This is a map of the greater Baltimore area. And you can see in the center is an I on that little green tab. And that I stands for incinerator. So many of us think that our trash gets picked up and taken to a landfill where it's essentially buried and sits there for ages, which is definitely the case sometimes. And often what happens is our trash gets taken to an incinerator where it's burned. So if you consider the trash that you produce for a second and think of what it would be like to burn it, I know what comes to my mind is wouldn't smell all that pleasant. I know that burning plastic, which there is plastic in my trash and even in the bag that's holding it, that does not smell pleasant. And part of the reason that it doesn't is because it's releasing things that aren't meant to be released. Plastic isn't made to be burned. And there are many materials that are that way. So it produces toxins and pollutants that get released into the air and into the communities where these incinerators are located. As we can also see on this map, if you look at the little legend on the right-hand side, that this incinerator is located in an area that is mostly people of color, which again speaks to this trend that we'll see in the maps following. Now look at Metro Houston. You can see another I there for incinerator. That one's a different color because it's a proposed incinerator. So we see that incinerator, and you see a bunch of other little green tabs that say O. That O stands for oil refinery. Right? Houston is in Texas. Texas has a lot of oil, so there are many refineries down there. And an oil refinery is where crude oil gets converted into the oil that we use in different ways, including gasoline that is put into cars. And oil refineries produce some really dirty and it's a long list of the toxins and pollutants that come out of those refineries. So if we look at this map, we can again see a trend that for the most part, not entirely, but the majority of these facilities are located in communities of color. And we can see another trend here, which is, this is the same map, although instead of showing the racial demographic of the community, it shows the income demographic. And again, not entirely, most of these facilities are located in low-income communities. So again, thinking to that not in my backyard idea of nobody wants these facilities in and around their neighborhoods. And some voices are heard louder than others when decisions are being made about where to put them. Here we have Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where we can see this trend pretty starkly. The map is fairly zoomed out, and still we can see that single incinerator in the area is in the lowest income. These are census tracts, so the lowest income area with one of the highest percentages of non-white folks living there. And as we move on, we'll take a look at Detroit. As I said, we'll be using Detroit as a case study. And for those less familiar with the city, if we look in this image right here with the gray scale, the darker border is really pretty much the city limits of Detroit. Detroit is 83 to 85% Black, and so we can see that in the demographic layout here. And Detroit has an oil refinery in the southwest area, and until recently an active incinerator, thanks to the tireless work of many activists and organizations, was actually shut down recently. And so, and that organizing was because of how it affected the people living near it. We have the oil refinery, which is located in 48217 is a zip code, which is the most polluted zip code in the state because of what that oil refinery puts out into the environment around it. So it pollutes the air. It's been a problem with water nearby. And it really deeply pollutes the bodies of the folks that live around there. There's very high instances of rare cancers and asthma, people missing work and school due to illnesses caused by living in close proximity to this refinery. Now with the incinerator, and we can look at this statistic here, which is that the statistic is from when it was active. So I adjusted the verbiage a bit because it is no longer active. But there were over 76,000 children living within 5 miles of the incinerator. 87% of residents within 1 mile are people of color, and 60% live below the federal poverty line. So that is to say that of the people most deeply affected by this incinerator being in their neighborhood, 87% of them people of color, and 60% of them live below the federal poverty line. And this statistic comes from Breathe Free Detroit, which is an organization that fought really hard and was one of the was on the front line of the fight to shut this incinerator down. Okay, so we've talked about oil refineries and incinerators and ways in these facilities can pollute the air and the bodies of people that live around them. And one thing we haven't talked so deeply about yet is water, right? That was something that came up in a lot of people's comments about something necessary, healthy and sustainable community, and it's absolutely true. And I'm curious, by show of hand, you can just raise your hand in your little box, how many people are familiar with the Flint water crisis? All right, so it looks like a decent amount of us. And so for those who aren't as familiar or could use a bit of a refresher, the Flint water crisis is a situation in which the people of Flint, Michigan noticed that their water was contaminated, and really brought that issue to light and said, our water is not clean, something's going on. And it was found that the water in Flint, Michigan, that was coming out of taps had very unhealthy and dangerously high levels of lead. The lead was being leached from the pipes, and the water going through those pipes brought that lead into the drinking and usable water in the city of Flint. And that gained a lot of national and international attention, which it absolutely deserved. And it's a problem that still needs rectification. And unfortunately, Flint is far from alone in that fight. Flint is by no means the only city that has experienced this or is experiencing this, as we can see by this map right here. This is a map of lead risk levels around the country, and the ones I highlighted are just levels 8, 9, and 10, the very highest lead risk levels in tap water around the country. So for context, we can see Flint right here, and unfortunately, they're far from alone in a quest and a need for lead-free water. Zooming into Southeast Michigan, where we can see Flint here again, which is about an hour and a half north of Detroit. We see Detroit here, which has also and does also experience this need for lead-free water, or water that's not contaminated by lead. And we'll hear from some of our panelists about how that has looked in the city and what action has been taken and what organizing has been done around this issue. Lead causes lasting effects, health effects, and neurological effects for the folks that come in contact with it, and it's simply not safe to have in the water supply. So we talked about a lot of things. We've looked at the racial and income disparity of where hazardous industries and facilities are placed. We've looked at the contamination of air and land and water in these different ways and some of the causes of that. And so recognizing that there's a whole lot to hold in what we've talked about so far. God willing, everyone has clean air to breathe around them. So I invite us all to kind of take a deep breath and hold it for a second, recognizing there's a lot going on in our brains. Yeah. All right, so there's a lot of, we've talked about a lot of things that are difficult and need change, right? And the good thing is I'm really thrilled to have the panelists that we have with us who can speak to some of the ways that we're not helpless in this, right? These aren't steadfast things that cannot change and that will not change. There's things we can do, and we have people that'll be sharing the experiences of what they do and what they've done to, again, not just move these hazards to other people's proverbial backyards, but to erase the need for them at all. Again, we don't want these hazards in anyone's backyard. We don't want them affecting anyone's community or family or selves. So I'm excited to introduce our panel a bit more formally. And I think we can spotlight them on the screen. Maybe if I stop sharing. So I'll hop off the screen share and Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. On our panel today, I'm really excited. I'm going to do this in the order. Oh, wonderful that they are in the chat. We have Julia Cuneo from Detroit Area Youth United Michigan, DAYUM, as their strategic coordinator. And Julia not only organizes with DAYUM, Julia also uplifts and empowers young people to use their voices and to organize with their power, which is really powerful and wonderful, and has worked on a lot of justice organizing really in and around Detroit. So super excited to have Julia and to hear from her. We have Brooke Solomon. Brooke is the founding chairperson for DAYUM's Youth Board of Directors. And I know Brooke has worked on campaigns around lead in the water, specifically in Detroit public schools. And so I'm excited to hear for her to share more about that experience and that activism with us. And we have Renee Wallace, Executive Director of FoodPLUS Detroit. And Renee has done work around the incinerator, both in Detroit and in other cities around the country as well, and is a strategist and an organizer, and has also done some deep work with compost as a solution to some of what we've been talking about. So welcome to all our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. And we'll start by getting to know our panelists a little more. And so perhaps we'll do this in order I see on my screen. So I'll start with Brooke, then Julia, and then Renee. I'd love if you could say a bit more about yourself and what your activism has looked like and what sparked that activism.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to be here. Like Hannah said, my name is Brooke. I'm 18 years old and I'm from Detroit, Michigan. But right now I'm currently based in Washington, D.C. because I'm a freshman at Howard University. And my activism has looked a lot of different ways over the years. I feel like we always get the question, oh, how did you start? And I always talk to Julia about this, but I just feel like growing up and experiencing life as a Black woman was the foundation for my activism. And having to fight from such a young age, even in spaces where I didn't know that I was fighting for myself or for other people. And that really heightened in high school or going into high school in Detroit public schools. I transferred from suburban schools to Detroit public schools in 8th grade. And there I was able to notice a stark difference in the quality of education. And I got involved in different clubs in high school, but clubs and just like community service wasn't enough. And in 2018 or 2017, I think I got involved with a Detroit organization where I met Julia. And in 2018, after the Parkland school shooting, I got together with a group of friends and we organized the Cass Tech Walkout, which is my high school. And we later went on to organize the Detroit March for Our Lives. And after that, we decided to continue organizing together, and that's how DAYUM was born. And for the last few years through DAYUM, we've done amazing things, including adult allyship trainings, Michigan youth conferences, movie nights for our members, activism teach-ins, and helping with the Detroit Public School water crisis. So yeah, that's just how I got involved.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, Julia, I would love to hear your story.
For sure. So my activism work, the first protest I ever did was in 4th grade. It was against Flag Day. And I really learned about a lot of the political opinions I had from my parents, who were very political. But they didn't give me a lot of skills for organizing. They taught me how to sort of fight somebody and like argue my point. They're both in law. So that's what they're good at. And they didn't necessarily tell me how to build those relationships with other people who are having similar problems or also agreed with me to build that power. So I had a lot of trouble in school, as you can imagine. Ended up dropping out of high school, went to college, and that's when I was introduced to the idea of community organizing. So sort of beyond just basic protests beyond just sort of throwing a fit in history class, but actually building power and making policy changes. And me at U of M Dearborn, I was like, someone really should have told me this in high school. So as soon as I graduated in 2015, I quit my job and started to do youth organizing. So I decided I was going to youth organize, and that was how I got in touch with We the People of Detroit, which is the group that I met Brooke through. I was doing trainings and programming for youth on how to do community organizing. And when the Parkland shootings happened and youth activism sort of got a national stage and a national presence, DAYUM was born out of that. And so my job at DAYUM is really to work for the young people. So Brooke was my boss. The DAYUM youth board is, they are my bosses. They tell me, we really want to work on this, or we're having a problem with this. And I say, okay, well, here's some other people who do that. And here's some ways we could get involved. And here are some skills we might need, right? So we build those skills together. But it's really about young people being at the front of that, because when we look at things like March for Our Lives, we see that young people are already leading. They don't need us to come through and say, here's how you think about social justice, and here's how you think about making change. They're doing those things already. So DAYUM is just about lifting that work up and giving them a venue and a vehicle for sharing their voices more powerfully. So that was how I ended up there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Mr. Renee.
Hi, good day, everyone. My name is Renee V Wallace here in Detroit, Michigan. And I'm probably the unusual suspect. I didn't necessarily ever consider myself, an activist. But when I've thought about it, if I had to define myself as an activist, I would say I'm a process activist. And I'm a late bloomer, by the way, too. So for me, I can remember kind of one of the things that triggered me, that got me on the path where I am with FoodPLUS Detroit. I was in a conversation with someone about food systems work, and he said, if we don't change our ways in how we manage food and water and the process of producing food, that there would not be enough food for people in 2050. And at the time, that was 2012, my grandson was 5 years old. And I was like, excuse me? What are you talking about? In 2050, I should be having great grandchildren. And it arrested me. And it brought me to a place of getting engaged in what was happening with the food systems work. And at that time, while I had a personal relationship with food, I didn't have a community relationship. I didn't have a public relationship of for community. And so when I first got involved in it, I started doing work with, because I'm a process change person professionally. So I tend to dive in and immerse myself in who's doing what. And so I was a little bit of everywhere trying to figure out who was doing what. And I landed with the Food Policy Council. And at that time, we were dealing with land access. And people did not have access and rights to grow food on land. It was just wasn't illegal. It just wasn't on the books in a way that allowed you to do it to protect yourself and your land and to be able to grow food. And so I remember I was facilitating conversations, community conversations about land ownership and what kind of changes did we want to see happen. And going before city council and speaking at the meetings and things like that. And that got me started in this space. And my focus is really about how do you facilitate that change? How do you get the processes changed? How do you get the policies changed? And how do you get people to understand those things, to be involved in the change? One of the areas when FoodPLUS was formed, we were looking at where could we put our focus and our energy that would have impact. And we chose composting as one of our initial projects. So in the beginning, it was all about just closing the food loop. It didn't have these other implications. But over the years, as I learned more about compost and not just about composting, because people want to fight about the act of composting and you don't want it here, you don't want it there, and why don't you want it? Learning about the benefits of compost helped me start to look at and think about both sides of the story. And how do you begin to advocate, activate, so that we can do things in a manner that is not harmful to our community by being more mindful and understanding around variables that make it safer. So Hannah mentioned the incinerator. I'm on a team with a woman from Breathe Free Detroit who fought the incinerator. And one of the things that she talks about all the time is a just transition from our waste, and that composting as an act of resistance. And so I'm doing work in Detroit now to help us create the environment, enable policy, enable practice, enable public, so that we have the right to not have our food. We diverted it from so the incinerator closed and then it goes to the landfill. Now, is that actually that's not necessarily better. The problem got moved somewhere else. It's still a problem. And we still need to address it and not have that go in the landfill at all. So that's the work that I'm involved in now. And that's kind of how I got into this.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and something that I noticed in what all of you said in different ways is there was a lot of not just the what, but the who, of working in relationship with other people, working in relationship with different organizations and organizing people around these issues. So as we went through the PowerPoint before of noticing all of the things that are wrong or bad, and instead of feeling shut down by it, something I noticed that each of you mentioned was like noticing an issue and feeling motivated and activated to do something about it, to make a change, to organize around that issue. And so I'm wondering if recognizing that organizing and relationship building is a central principle on which your work is based. If you can speak to the difference between service and base building. So this being a one-off like project or even an information campaign, and building a base around a base that rallies around these issues and fights until there is change made. Okay, we can continue to go in the same order, or wondering from the DAYUM perspective in terms of being an organizing group, what the thought is around that, or activating around an issue.
Yeah, I can hit on this a little bit, and then I'll pass it over to Brooke, because I know she has thoughts on this, because you mentioned even in your intro, Brooke, that you were doing a lot of service programs, right? And so we see that a lot in Detroit. There's a lot of groups, especially for youth, that are, we're going to work with the youth and we're going to go clean up an alley, or we are going to paint some lockers. And those are great, and I'm glad they exist. I don't want to diss them at all. But there was a real need and a real thirst for more, and for something that challenged, like you brought up, Hannah, at the very beginning, the reason for why we have these problems in the first place, that went more to the root cause. And so DAYUM is a base building organization, and that's really key to our work, because we're not just about service, and DAYUM doesn't consider itself a service organization or a leadership development organization. It really considers itself an organization of protest and mobilization and power, right? So when we go into school board meetings, for example, and we speak at school board meetings, we're not going there to try and get their approval. We're not going there because we want Dr. Beatty, who's the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools, for example, to suddenly change his mind and change his policy. We want him to see that if he doesn't change his policy, his life will be difficult until he does. Things like we will show up at meetings and we will speak at them. We will put press releases in the newspaper and hold protests outside of his office and show up and show up and show up until he changes. That doesn't mean he agrees with us. That doesn't mean that he likes us. It doesn't mean we're friends, but he will do what the young people of Detroit need and say they need. And he will trust and listen to their leadership and their voice. So that's really the key difference, is the difference between, service, which is so important and so necessary and so beautiful, but also building power so that when Dr. Vitti says, I don't want to do that, we can say, well, you need to anyway, So, and Brooke, maybe you can say a little bit more about how we've done that or how you've experienced that.
Yeah, you touched a lot on that, Julia, how DAYUM is so different in that way. Like I mentioned before, like going into high school, obviously, like there are so many more opportunities for clubs and different experiences, but so many of them were just based on community service and like the day-to-day, like what can we do? I don't know if like any of you are familiar with the club called Build On, or the program. It's in a lot of schools nationwide, but I was like really active in Build On. When I mean like active, I mean like putting in like hundreds of hours. But it was all for just like, I thought that it seemed like I was doing more than what I was actually doing, in the way that we knew what some of the problems were, like as young people, like we see them so blatantly, like we see the lack of teachers in our schools, we see the lack of textbooks in our schools, we see our communities because we live in them. But a lot of the things that we were doing in these like service organizations were just putting a Band-Aid on a like bullet hole problem. And DAYUM was different in the way that we weren't trying to, how do I say this? I saw this tweet a few weeks ago that touched on wanting to be terrifying in your activism. And I can relate that a lot to DAYUM and my own personal feelings of wanting to be terrifying to these systems of oppression. I'm not trying to be nice. I'm not trying to be of service to anyone. I'm trying to be terrifying. And I feel that resonates a lot with DAYUM because we're an organization that was built off of wanting to be more than what was already there, and wanting to provide an outlet for young people to not just be a part of more like leadership development or like cleaning up a classroom or painting a mural, but challenging these things that have existed for so long, especially in Detroit public schools. And I feel like that was so important to the young people who founded DAYUM and the young people who have been affected by DAYUM and will continue to be affected by DAYUM, because we kind of emerged as a like force to be reckoned with in our communities, especially in Detroit public schools, which had been filled with so much corruption, like so many bad things, and we weren't going to do that anymore. And that's where I really saw the difference between like service-based organizations and these sort of like power and like structural change based organizations. And I can also say that because my activism there's a lot of duality in it. I was also part of the High School Democrats of America in high school. And that organization compared to DAYUM was so different because it was based on like, what's the day-to-day, like how can we have these meetings and talk about these issues? Like, can we talk about police brutality? Can we talk about violence against Black women? Like, can we talk about educational inequity? Where DAYUM was sort of, we're done talking about these things. Like, what more do we need to talk about? Because people are suffering. We can see it. We are all a part of this. So what can we do? And I think that was so important. And that's so important to the next step of a lot of people's like organizing journeys and a lot of organizations, period. Like, what are you going to do? What are you going to put on the line? What are you going to risk to make sure that your organization is really challenging the things that need to be challenged? Because DAYUM risked a lot, and the young people in DAYUM continue to risk a lot in terms of organizing within like school systems and systems where you have to be a part of things. Like going to school while you're organizing against your school is probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life. That was the periods of time for DAYUM. I think we'll probably talk about like our water justice initiative later, but that was like absolutely ridiculous, having to go and look in the eyes of your administrators when you just put out like a press release about how horrible they are, and they have the power to call you into their office. They have the power to have security guards follow you. They have the power to do all of these things, but you continue to push and push and push. And I feel like I've been talking for a long time, but that's what makes DAYUM so special.
That was good.
Thank you for that. And I would actually love if you, in a couple sentences, could describe, when you talk about the water justice fight that you had, what you did and what the issue was.
Yeah, so in 2019, I don't know what, 2018, Detroit Public School students returned to school after summer break with no clean running water. We found out basically the week of school when we got back that our water had been shut off district-wide because of elevated levels of lead and copper. And the only thing that was sent out was like a robocall and like a paper for parents to read, but it did not explain how we got here and steps to get out of the situation, nor did it touch on any sort of accountability from like district-wide leadership. And that was really scary because like you're in school 8 hours a day. Some of us are in school way longer than 8 hours a day, and you're in these buildings that don't provide clean running water. And at first they provided like bottled water and like water coolers, like the ones you see in like offices. But I went to a school that was 2,500 kids, not including staff, and it was 6 floors, and one water cooler on each floor was not going to cut it. And soon we saw the water bottles trickle out to non-existence. We saw the water coolers would be emptied out by second period, and you would go the rest of the day without access to like drinkable water unless you brought it from home. And so DAYUM came together and was like, okay, what are we going to do about this? And so at first we wanted to push our district-wide administration to do something, to literally just do anything, to give us something. So we staged a strike on Count Day, and Count Day is really important for Michigan schools because it's about funding. So you go to school and you get counted, and that's how the state or the whatever gets like funding for the school. And it wasn't really about funding because you can count or it wasn't really about counting because you can count students through the count period, but we wanted to strike on this specific day with the specific message of do we count, because you're not going to come in here and use us, like count us and get money for us when we don't even have clean water. And so we hosted this strike, and we provided a freedom school for kids who were striking to come and learn about like water justice initiatives that have been going on in the city, to learn about social justice and to learn about things that we actually wanted to learn about. And then we went on to think bigger, and it was sort of like, okay, the water shut off in our schools because of elevated levels of lead and copper, but what about the rest of our communities? Because I lived like 3 blocks away from my school, like I walked to my school. So if my school's water is contaminated, then what about my water at home? So we partnered with the University of Michigan Biological Station and what was the environmental justice organization, Freshwater, something, Julie,
Yeah, Freshwater Futures.
Freshwater Futures, okay, yeah. And we went to the neighborhoods of 3 high schools in Detroit and tested their water. So Cody, Denby, and Cass Tech, which kind of like were east, west, and kind of central, creating a little triangle, so that we could figure out the problem for ourselves, and so that we could do something that our district wasn't doing, that our city wasn't doing. So that was kind of like the basics.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
And yeah, Renee, talking about base building and working in relationship to solve problems, would love to hear.
Yeah, so the approach that we're taking, because as I said, when I shifted and we began to understand the power of compost to address issues, in our community, our air, our food issues, the water, cleanliness, all of those kinds of things are impacted by our soil. It's impacted by, we have the opportunity to do something. So we spend time educating. So we, FoodPLUS and a few other organizations, we created these pilots to help begin to demonstrate the power of what we want versus what we don't want, right? We already know we don't want materials going into the landfill, turning into methane, then we got to breathe it. So at first it was the incinerator and the air, and the incinerator got closed, but the problem just moved to the landfills. So the landfills are still releasing something we don't want. So maybe it's not in our personal backyard anymore, but it's in somebody else's backyard. And so how do you help people think about it in terms of things that are relevant to them? So when you talk about climate, sometimes I heard somebody say earlier today that sometimes people get exhausted when they hear the terms because everything feels so big. So we're using the pilots where we're actually demonstrating how to do an alternative. So with education, people, don't know where a way is. When you say, where does it go? When it gets in the black can, they don't know where a way is. So we talk to them about what a way is, and then putting your hands on the power of producing something different yourself. So we're doing pilots around the city so that people can see that you can take this out of your house, your neighbors' houses, the businesses in your area, and take that resource away from the landfill. So you can starve it, just redirect it in a way for yourself. So our form of activism is really through education, is through equipping people. We're also working to change the policy environment. Hannah hears me talk about the 3 EPs all the time: enable policy, enable practice, enable public. So how do you get the environment such that it allows for it? So we have to have conversations with people who are not exactly jumping up and down about, we want to do this right now. We've made headway, in the last year. So we're getting, more support around it, but you still have to constantly address people's issues. Why don't you want to allow this? Even though you may know it was better, but you're fighting against what you might think is bad acting. Well, bad acting is still putting it in a landfill, but bad acting is also people not doing it well. So we work both sides of it, right? Where it's helped the public trickle it up. I have another term I heard the other day, which I thought was really good, was trickle up as opposed to trickle down. So my thing is, we're creating the culture for something so that your voice is the one that the leaders who have the power to make the change are hearing our voices. Instead of waiting for them to change, we're saying we're already changing. We're already doing this, and we need you to change these laws and conditions to allow for it. It's our city. This is what we want to be able to do. And so we're doing it by demonstration. We're going to educate people, organize so they know how to do it themselves, so that you don't have to worry about somebody's voice saying, we don't want this. We're going to show up and tell you we want it. And we're going to be constantly feeding you the information that facilitates the change. And so that's the approach that we're taking, and knowing the power of being able to take something and make it a resource of your own. So we're reclaiming it. We're just reclaiming them and making it into power in our communities, because we're going to have better soil, and having better soil means we're going to have better food. We're going to have better roads. We're going to have better conditions because the flooding can be controlled because we improve the quality of our soil. And so getting people to understand the power behind the action, and it's not just about not throwing it in the black can. It's about all the stuff that you want. And how can you engage, in the process, starting from little bitty people. I tell people, you're closer than you think. We learned in kindergarten how to sort, right? Sort, put this here, put this here, put this here. So we're really trying to get it down to practical levels where people can understand it and can respond and can advocate for it with their own voices, with support.
I love the way you said, you referred to, as you're talking about trash that people are throwing away, and using the word resource. with the word trash, and how if we know how to sort it and be able to take our organic waste, so whatever we're eating and whatever food waste we have or yard waste or any organic matter, not necessarily organically grown, just any carbon-based thing that we consume, food, meat, any plant, anything, bread, and use it kind of like one person's trash is another person's treasure. If it doesn't need to go in the trash, it can be converted into soil and into compost, which will nourish the soil, nourish the land, and in return, again, that reciprocity that was mentioned before, nourish us and the rest of life, really. So something that strikes me again, and a common theme was, again, noticing a problem and wanting to do something about it. And so I want to take a step even further back from that, which is when we don't know there's a problem. And so I'm using myself as an example. I grew up in a suburb of Detroit where I was lucky to have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, and wasn't concerned about contaminants in the soil. And so it was not even in part of my consciousness to think about the fact that that wasn't a ubiquitous thing, even for people not very far away from me. And so as someone who spent most of my life, I would say, unaware of these problems, and then I moved to Detroit, went to a university very near to the incinerator, and now live in a neighborhood right next to where the oil refinery is. It's only at that point in my life that I became aware. So while some of us live in the communities and feel these direct effects, others of us don't. And I'm wondering what you say to those living up the affected areas, and what can we do? How can we organize and be supportive?
Hannah, I think that in many cases, it starts with the conversations, creating some awareness, come and see, show people, and also talking about it. I have a lot of friends that don't live in the city, right? And, when we were talking and fighting for land to be able to grow food, because people thought that was crazy, that it wasn't on the books, and they didn't understand it. And so, but talking to them and letting them see it, come see. Because a lot of times, yes, because it's not right in your face, yeah, you don't have an awareness. But sometimes you need to come see and do it in a safe way. It's not to shame or embarrass or any of that. It's to create this awareness. I can remember when we first started in some of the earlier days with the food systems work, just bringing people would come in and we would ride through neighborhoods, and you could just sit and watch people's faces. And the reality starts to sink in that this is different than your experience. People want to say that there's no inequity, there's no this, no that, but you need to come and see and experience some things, and do it with people who can hold space for you in a way that's not going to shield you from the pain or shield you from what you need to feel, but hold it in such a way that you can move from that to the next, to a different place, to a different action, a different reality.
I would say something that my mentor, Monica Lewis Patrick at We the People of Detroit, always says is deputize yourself. And I love when she says that because it has so many different meanings for different people. But one of the things I really think is important to think about, especially with the water crisis in Flint and Detroit and the air pollution in Detroit, is that these issues don't stop at the Detroit border. There's nothing about them that are Detroit specific. In fact, I would say that there is no water crisis without the suburbs. Detroit built the suburbs, and that's how we ended up with the water system that we have. And so if you live in the Metro Detroit area, you are implicated in that system. You're part of the Regional Water Authority, the Great Lakes Water Authority, which decides water prices in Detroit. You're part of the regional water system and the watershed, and that impacts Detroiters, but it also impacts you. And so I really think as organizers, we can't just think of like, oh, well, how can people from the suburbs come in and save Detroiters? Because that's not going to work. That's not okay. And it's not helpful. But how can people in places like Warren and Bloomfield Hills and Royal Oak and Grosse Pointe look in their own backyards and say, how is this implicating me? How is this manifesting in my community? And where can I make some inroads to justice for everybody on both sides of that border, of that city border? Because justice for Detroit means justice for those other communities. We're really in this together. And I did want to lift up the Climate Justice Alliance, CJA, which Ms. Renee brought up just transition earlier. And I really think just transition is this framework that is so powerful for everybody. And it's something that we all have to start thinking about as we see the impacts of climate change on these communities and on our communities. So definitely would look up CJA and just transition if you get a chance.
Thank you. And yeah, Brooke, definitely want to give you a chance to respond. And I also, time flies when you're having fun. I just noticed the time. So I want to honor that as well. But yeah, Brooke, would love to hear if you have something you'd like to add.
Yeah, I just really agree with what was just said, especially with what Julia said. I think it's really important for people to understand that like, we're all constantly learning. Like I'm still learning. Everyone will always be learning for the rest of their lives. And that's what's really a really amazing thing about organizing and activism is that there's always someone who you can learn from. And so I think a lot of us just have to look beyond where we are to find organizations and find people to connect with and to act in allyship with. And one of the big things that I've been learning this year is what actually is justice. And what is not justice. And so I think that once we begin to understand that like things like diversity and inclusion or like multiculturalism is not necessarily justice, then we can begin to see like what is justice. And that is like we said, like clean water, that is access to foods, that is like prison abolition. And so that's where we see like the bigger picture and the deeper meaning of justice. And that's how we can expand our fight past our own borders and our own self-interest. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I just want to amplify what everyone has been saying on this panel, which is, I think what's swirling in my head is this idea around the importance of understanding where we're situated in these issues and whether or not we notice them in our own lives as being directly impacted, to notice where we exist and in the greater scheme of things. And if there is a problem anywhere along that line, you know, anywhere we exist downstream, to activate around it, right? To not sit back and say, well, that, you know, the system's messed up, or this isn't ideal, or that's really unfortunate that other people have to breathe polluted air. To activate and to do something about it. And that a really impactful and perhaps the most impactful way to do that is to work together, right? To build relationship, to organize, to question the systems and hold them accountable to who they're supposed to be serving, which is us, right? And so again, so much gratitude to all of our speakers. And I think it's really beautiful when we're able to learn from people who have done work on the ground. And I think it's really special that you all are my teachers. And it's really special to be able to learn from all of you and the work that you're doing and what you've dedicated lives and so much of your time and energy to. So thank you for being here and for what you do. And thank you all for being part of this conversation, for listening in and contributing in the chat, and for the work that you'll jump into following this session. And thanks again to Sarah for doing our tech. Right.
Thanks, Hannah, for the invite.